3. On the Jewish question. The second contribution which Marx published in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher is not so arresting in its form, but in the power of critical analysis it displays it as almost superior. In this second contribution he examines the difference between human emancipation and political emancipation on the basis of two treatises on the Jewish question written by Bruno Bauer. At that time the question had not sunk so deeply into the morass of anti-Semitic and pro-Semitic badgering. A class of society which was increasing its power as one of the most prominent representatives of mercantile and loan capital was deprived of all civil rights on account of its religion. With the exception of those special privileges it enjoyed as a result of its usurious practices. The most famous representative of enlightened absolutism, the philosopher of Sanssouci, Frederick the Great, gave the world an edifying object lesson by granting the liberty of Christian bankers to those moneyed Jews who assisted him in his coining forgeries and other doubtful financial operations, while he tolerated the presence of the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn within his territory, not because the latter was a philosopher and strove to guide his nation into the intellectual life of Germany, but because he occupied the post of bookkeeper to one of the privileged and moneyed Jews. His dismissal by his master would have deprived him of all rights. With one or two exceptions, even the pioneers of the bourgeois Enlightenment movement displayed no particular objection to the proscription of a whole section of the population merely on account of its religion. The Israelitic religion was repugnant to them because it was the prototype of religious intolerance from which Christianity had first learned its human censoriousness, whilst, on the other hand, the Jews showed no interest whatever in the bourgeois Enlightenment movement. The Jews were delighted when enlightened criticism took the Christian religion to task, for they had themselves always cursed it. But when the same criticism turned its attention to the Jewish religion they howled aloud as though humanity were being betrayed. The Jews demanded political emancipation for Judaism, but not in the sense of equal rights for all and with the intention of abandoning their own special position, but rather with the intention of consolidating that special position. And all the time they were prepared to abandon liberal principles the moment they came into conflict with any specifically Jewish interest. The criticism of religion conducted by the young Hegelians of course extended to the Jewish religion, which they regarded as a preliminary stage of Christianity. Feuerbach had analyzed Judaism as the religion of egoism. The Jews have maintained their special peculiarities down to the present day. Their principle, their God, is the practical principle of the world, egoism in the form of religion. Egoism centers and concentrates man upon himself, but at the same time it limits his theoretical outlook because he is indifferent to everything which is not directly related to his own welfare. Bruno Bauer said much the same thing, declaring that the Jews had crawled into the nooks and crannies of bourgeois society to exploit its uncertain elements like the gods of Epicurus who lived in the interstices of the world, where they were freed from certain labor. The religion of the Jews was animal cunning and trickery, and with it they satisfied their sensual needs. They had always opposed historical progress, and in their hatred of all other peoples they had cut themselves off from the world and lived the most fantastic and circumscribed life. Feuerbach explained the character of the Jewish religion from the character of the Jew, while Bauer, despite thoroughness, daring and trenchancy in his treatises on the Jewish question, which earned high praise from Marx, saw the question exclusively through theological spectacles. Like the Christians, he declared, the Jews could win through to freedom only by overcoming their religion. Owing to its own religious character, the Christian state was unable to emancipate the Jews, whilst at the same time the Jews could not be emancipated owing to their own religious character. Christians and Jews must cease to be Christians and Jews if they wished to be free. But since Judaism as a religion had been superseded by Christianity, the Jew had a longer and more difficult path to traverse than the Christian before he could win freedom. In Bauer's opinion, the Jew must first take a course in Christianity and Hegelian philosophy before he could hope to emancipate himself. At this point Marx intervened, declaring that it was not enough to ask who was to do the emancipating and who was to be emancipated. Criticism must go further and ask what kind of emancipation was in question, political emancipation or human. In certain states both Christians and Jews were completely emancipated politically without thereby being humanly emancipated. There must therefore be some difference between political emancipation and human emancipation. The essence of political emancipation was the highly developed modern state, which was also the fully developed Christian state. For the Christian Germanic state, the state of privileges, represented only the incomplete, the still theological state not yet developed in all its political clarity. However, the political state in the highest stages of its development did not demand the abandonment of Judaism by the Jews or the abandonment of religion in general by humanity as a whole. It had emancipated the Jews, and its very character had compelled it to do so. Even where the state constitution expressly declared the exercise of political rights to be completely independent of religious beliefs, the citizens of that state nevertheless refused to believe that a man without religion could be a decent man and a good citizen. Thus the existence of religion was not in any way in contradiction to the full development of the state. The political emancipation of the Jew, of the Christian, of the religious man in general, was the emancipation of the state from Judaism, Christianity and religion in general. The state could shake off a restraint, though the human being in the state need not be free of it, and herein lay the limit of political emancipation. Marx develops this idea even further. The state as such negatived private property. Man liquidated private property in a political fashion. Immediately he abolished the property qualification for the active and passive franchise, as had been done in many of the North American states. The state liquidated differences in birth, social standing, education and occupation in its own way when it declared differences of birth, social standing, education and occupation to be unpolitical differences, and when, regardless of such differences, it declared every member of the body politic to be an equal participant in the sovereignty of the people. Nevertheless, the state permitted private property, education and occupation to operate in their own fashion and to make their own particular character felt, that is to say, as private property, education and occupation. Far from abolishing these actual differences, the existence of the state rather presupposed their existence. It regarded itself purely as a political state and made its universality felt in contrast to these its constituent elements. The fully developed political state was essentially the social life of humanity as against its material life. All the hypotheses of this egoistic life remained in existence outside the state sphere in bourgeois society and as attributes of bourgeois society. The relation of the political state to its own hypotheses, whether they are material elements such as private property, or ideological elements such as religion, was the antagonism between public interests and private interests, the conflict in which the human being as the adherent of a particular religion found himself with his state citizenship and with other men as members of the community, reduced itself to the cleavage between the political state and bourgeois society. Bourgeois society is the basis of the modern state as classical slavery was the basis of the classical state. The modern state recognized its origins with the proclamation of the general rights of man, whose enjoyment is as much open to the Jews as the exercise of political rights. The general rights of man recognize the egoistic bourgeois individual and the untrammeled movement of the intellectual and material elements which make up the content of his life and the content of contemporary bourgeois life. They do not free man from religion, but give him religious freedom. They do not free him from property, but give him the freedom of property. They do not free him from the indignity of trading, but give him freedom to trade. The political revolution created bourgeois society by destroying the patchwork system of feudalism. All the corporations, guilds and associations which were so many expressions of the separation of the people from the commonwealth. It created the political state as the concern of all, as a real state. Marx then sums up, political emancipation is the reduction of man to a member of bourgeois society, to the egoistic independent individual, on the one hand, and to a citizen of the state, a moral being, on the other. Only when the real individual reabsorbs the abstract citizen of the state and becomes a social being, in practical life, in his own work and under his own conditions, only when man recognizes and organizes his forces proprios as social forces and, therefore, no longer separates the social force from himself in the form of political force, only then will the emancipation of humanity be completed. The contention that the Christian as such was more capable of emancipation than the Jew, a contention which Bauer sought to prove from the Jewish religion, still remained to be examined. Marx proceeded from Feuerbach, who had explained the Jewish religion from the Jew and not the Jew from the Jewish religion, but he went beyond Feuerbach by revealing the special social element which reflects itself in the Jewish religion. What was the secular basis of Judaism? Practical necessity, self-interest. What was the secular cult of the Jew? Buying and selling. What was his secular god? Money. Very well then, emancipation from buying and selling and from money, that is to say, from practical, Real Judaism would be the self-emancipation of our time, an organization of society which abolished the necessary conditions for buying and selling, that is to say, the possibility of buying and selling would make the Jew impossible. His religious consciousness would evaporate in the clear and vital atmosphere of society. On the other hand, when the Jew recognizes this practical character of his as futile and works for its abolition, then he is working from the basis of his own previous development for the emancipation of humanity itself and turns against the highest practical expression of human self-alienation. Marx regards Judaism as a general, contemporary, antisocial element driven to its present height by historical development and the zealous cooperation of the Jews themselves, a height at which it must necessarily dissolve itself. What Marx achieved with this treatise was a twofold gain. He went to the very roots of the connection between society and the state. The state was not, as Hegel imagined, the reality of the moral idea, absolute reason and the absolute aim in itself, and it had to content itself with the incomparably more modest task of presiding over the anarchy of bourgeois society which had enrolled it as watchman. This anarchy was the general struggle of man against man, of individual against individual, the universal war of all individuals, separated from each other only by their individuality, the general and unhindered movement of all the elementary forces released from their feudal fetters. It was actual slavery, although the individual seemed free and independent to himself, mistaking the unhindered movement of his alienated elements such as property, industry and religion for his own freedom, whereas in reality it represented his complete enslavement and alienation from humanity. And then Marx recognized that the religious questions of the day had no more than a social significance. He showed the development of Judaism not in religious theory, but in industrial and commercial practice, which found a fantastic reflection in the Jewish religion. Practical Judaism is nothing but the fully developed Christian world. As bourgeois society is of a completely commercial Jewish character, the Jew necessarily belongs to it and can claim political emancipation just as he can claim the general rights of man. However, the emancipation of humanity is a new organization of the social forces, which will make man the master of those sources which give him life. Thus, in shadowy contours, we observe an outline of socialist society beginning to form. In the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch Marx is still ploughing the philosophic field, but in the furrows turned over by his critical plowshare. The first shoots of the materialist conception of history began to sprout, and under the warm sun of French civilization they soon shot up into flower.